This week in the enterprise security news, Proofpoint's $300 million buyback program, LogRhythmn Power Users share their use cases, Bitdefender Enhances MDR Service to increase proactive protection, Anchore Unveils Enterprise 2.4 with expanded and updated capabilities, and Auth0's new bot detection. In the second segment, 2 pre-recorded interviews from Security Weekly Virtual Hacker Summer Camp with Corey Bosden from Deepwatch, Michael Sanders from ExtraHop. In the final segment, you guessed it, 2 more interviews from Security Weekly Virtual Hacker Summer Camp, Ian McShane of CrowdStrike, and Michael Borachowski. How did you say that, Matt? Borachowski, thank you from Synopsys. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. Today, every business is a digital business. Most of us are migrating workloads to the cloud, adopting DevOps tools, rolling out RPA software, and supporting a remote workforce. While opportunity is great, so is the risk of advanced cyber attacks. Many high-profile breaches start with a compromise of privileged credentials. CyberArk is the #1 leader in privileged access management. Talk to CyberArk today to secure privileged access for humans and machines across hybrid and cloud environments and on endpoints. Learn more at securityweekly.com/CyberArk and stay one step ahead of the attackers. Detecting and responding to threats in the cloud is harder than doing it on-prem. Even when you do have the visibility you need, legacy security workflows weren't designed for the speed and complexity of cloud environments. Cloud-native security solutions from ExtraHop are purpose-built to spot threats across the hybrid attack surface, provide detailed investigation steps, and help you automate response. Request your 30-day free trial at securityweekly.com/ExtraHop. Welcome, everyone, to episode 197 of Enterprise Security Weekly for September 2nd, 2020. I am your host, Paul Asadorian, joined remotely by Mr. John Strand. John, welcome.
Hey, this is like 2 weeks in a row. It's amazing.
You're like movie poster crazy, too. It's so cool. I love movie posters, too. Mr. Matt Alderman's here with us. Welcome, Matt.
Happy Wednesday. Yeah, no movie posters here. A few Ansel Adam prints over there, but no movie posters.
Ansel Adams.
Quick announcement before we get started, because I know John has to run. So join our mailing list for webcast virtual training announcements. Receive your personal invite to our Discord server. You can do all of that. Subscribe to all of our shows as well on securityweekly.com/subscribe. We are ramping up our webcast training schedule for the rest of 2020. In September, learn how to extend the enterprise network for remote workers and protect your home network. Find out why traditional security can't be zero trust, and learn to reduce the blast radius of your cloud infrastructure. securityweekly.com/webcast. Lots of webcasts coming up /on demand if you missed one. Alrighty, on to the news for this week. Some interesting stories this week. Not as many, but I tried to dig into the ones we had.
There's a lot of funding announcements and some acquisition stuff. We should do that later after John has to go. Yeah. We should get into some of the product announcements because it'd be fun to get John's take on a few of those.
Yeah. John, was there one that you wanted to start with?
Real quick. I did want to talk a little bit about the Signal Sciences one. I know that's an acquisition, but Signal Sciences, I don't know about you guys, but whenever we see a company like Signal Sciences, that we were there at the beginning and we were interviewing them and they were on our show and they had a really cool approach to like web application firewalls and handling web application security that actually works, which is super cool. And then seeing them in our pen tests and it actually working, it makes me very happy to see a company that, gets acquired for $775 million that we were kind of there at the beginning and kind of, saw them grow up. It's very cool.
It's a cool success story. I mean, for them, I don't want to downplay, congrats to Zane and team. It's outstanding. But I mean, from the get-go, the first introduction to Signal Sciences, I was like, these folks are awesome, right? The product's awesome. Everyone we've worked with at Signal Sciences has been awesome over the years. So huge win for the team there, and a huge win for the community because, to have a product that works and see them grow, I mean, that's what we strive for, right? And to see one of our sponsors go through that journey is really awesome too.
You bet. I did want to talk a little bit about Bitdefender, if that's okay with y'all.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yep.
So this is that MDR space, the managed detection and response space. And I've talked about it briefly in some of the earlier shows, and I really kind of want to talk about what I think MDR actually is and why I think it's important and why I really, really like what's here. And then I want to talk about Elastic in just a second. But whenever you're looking at something like the MDR space, honestly, what has happened in many security companies that were doing SOC services, right? They would do full SOC as a service. I think, talking with a lot of these firms, that they realized that a lot of the logs and the alerting that you get of general standard Active Directory logs, workstation logs, server logs, web service logs were crap. They were garbage. And what MDR is basically doing is basically focusing on the EDR space. We're looking at the endpoint and actually working with endpoint agents and endpoint services, because those are far better logs and telemetry than you would get out of this other crap. So it's almost like this entire industry has jettisoned the stuff that doesn't work and they're focusing on what does. So it's really, really cool talking about MDR services. The one thing I do want to talk about is Elastic is now entering the space really heavy. They now have their security, endpoint security agent for Windows, Linux, and Mac, and they're giving it away for free. So we're definitely going to see some other big players enter the space. And the thing I wanted to ask both of you is, do you believe the EDR, MDR space is saturated, or do you think it's still something that has some growth opportunities for firms looking to diversify their security?
I think there's going to be, and there already has been, consolidation in the space, right? And I think you're going to have some interesting decisions based on the requirements of your enterprise business, right? And that is, do you want to consolidate the EDR piece, the endpoint security, the anti-malware, and detection on one agent, right? Which is where we're seeing the market going. I mean, there's lots of great technology out there today that you can basically combine that all into one. Heck, you can even roll patching up into that, and do that all conceivably with one agent and one platform. That I think is pretty exciting. I think also for enterprises, they may end up with separate solutions based on their requirements. So I do think there's not an oversaturation in the market today, because I do think people's requirements are going to change. But I think for many, especially smaller enterprises, you're going to consolidate everything on one platform, because I think people are making that work today, right? Elastic is an example of that.
And I also look, kind of the evolution, Paul, of you and me over the years. We were always like, roll your own, do your own stuff, have your own homegrown security. And I think that that's great for medium and large scale enterprises. But you and I traditionally have not been very good at empathizing or even understanding like the small market space. Yeah. And I really believe that's where that MDR space is going to explode, because for years people have been like, well, we're going after small businesses. And we'd laugh because there was hardly any money in doing that. And I think with this MDR space, there is money in doing that. Mm-hmm. And I think you can absolutely see a few more vendors on the space pop up as well.
Well, I think from an MDR perspective, you will. I think there is saturation in the EDR vendors, though. Look, we've already picked some of those winning horses. We know who they are. It's the CrowdStrikes, the Endgames, the Carbon Blacks, et cetera, right? We know who those players are. And what the MDR vendors are doing now is taking those solutions and bringing them together around a managed service to manage that for smaller customers. And I think you're right, John. That's where the market is, the small to mediums, the guys kind of below the middle to large enterprises that can roll their own. They need help, right? And so that's where they fit. So there is a saturation, I think, in the EDR space, because we've seen that consolidation. I think the MDR market has potential growth still, because these MSSPs are going to add more and more capabilities like an MDR service. So you'll see some more of that. But they're going to pick winners. And we already know where some of those winners are in the space. What I think is the next evolution of this is to talk about Paul's Enchanted Quadrants a bit. This is where Elastic's going, right? You bring log data, you bring the SIEM, you bring threat intelligence with the endpoint. Now you're completing that whole magic quadrant set that Paul talks about, those Enchanted Quadrants. That's where I think you see some additional consolidation and MSSPs offering kind of that bundled set of services together.
Well, and if we talk about the Elastic thing a little bit more, I've never seen a company move as quickly as Elastic has. When you're looking at Elastic and you talked about the endpoint and you talked about the logs and pulling that in, Elastic has always had that with like elk stacks. But then now they're adding in packet beats, right? So now you can get network level telemetry off of the endpoints. And that's huge as well, even though there's some problems with their sniffing drivers, NPCAP that they use from Theodore, but that's a whole nother question. But what they're doing is they're tying this all together into an offering. And more importantly, they have their free offering that they're releasing. So they're basically ready-made, creating tons of people that are using their free products that makes that transition into their commercial products that easy to do. So honestly, if I was going to pick someone moving forward in the future, without question, I would pick Elastic.
Agreed.
Got the stuff there, yeah.
John, did you happen to see the LogRhythm article?
I saw the LogRhythm one. Wait a minute, which one is that? I may not have it up right now. Well, can you give me the title here real quick?
The one where their customers had some testimonials.
Oh, their use cases.
Yeah, and I thought there was 3 in there, and I picked one. And if you follow that link, there's a link to another blog post that describes it in more detail. Like, they basically created this visualization dashboard that was based on some custom queries to their Microsoft environment, I believe, in their ticketing environment. I just thought they did a really nice job with it. I wanted to highlight that.
Well, and let's also talk about, like, LogRhythm is another one of those companies that's doing it the right way. They don't have open source per se, but think about all the free crap that LogRhythm gives away. Like Netmon, Netmon Freemium, they've been releasing that for a long time. This is just, I think this is the way that you get trust in people. And once again, LogRhythm is a company that we see in our testing. We see them actually effective in detecting a large number of different attacks. So, LogRhythm is another company that's been with us forever. I think they were at a couple of Security Weekly parties that I went to. They actually had some people come and just literally hang out with us in the middle of a blizzard, which was awesome.
Yes.
But talking about Paul's Enchanted Quadrants, they've built a lot of those components into the LogRhythm solution. They're not just the SIM. They have the endpoint capability. They've got some stuff on the network with the Netmon stuff. They've been doing this. They kind of rolled their own and did it themselves, right? But they've also brought a lot of those capabilities together in a single platform.
Yep.
Absolutely. Let's see. Centrify has released Privilege Access 20.04, and they're basically have implemented a system for managing privileges across SSH. When we look at a lot of DevOps environments, it's great to have containers and cloud native services, but you do end up with systems that require SSH authentication in your design, especially in larger enterprises with so many applications. There's just certain things, you could do it all cloud native, and that takes time, right? I was just looking at something like, we've got some web scraping stuff, and I'm like, well, I'm going to run on a container, and I built it and it's done. And you can do it in Lambda, but you got to figure out how to do it in Lambda and then operationalize that, and that takes time. So I think we're going to have systems around where we might have keys to manage stuff, right? And so I think it was a good announcement from Centrify.
Yep.
Yeah, I see this as a catch-up feature with what CyberArk and the Conjur acquisition has already done, right? Everybody's playing catch-up in some respects in the cloud space a little bit. So you see these guys now adding additional privilege access vaulting capabilities for these environments. Because look, this is where stuff's moving. Stuff is moving into the cloud. They're moving into microservice architectures. Yep. This all has to be managed too.
Well, and we've been saying it for a really, really, really long time. And COVID really accelerated this. Identity is your perimeter now. And I can't remember, there's a couple of vendors that use some variation of that for their corporate catchphrase. But there's no question that identity is the perimeter. And I think there are some firms that are positioned that have been kind of working with identity and access management solutions for years that are in a really good position to take advantage of that. And I think you're absolutely right, Matt. I think that there's a bunch of companies that are flat out making a catch-up play at this point because they're not detecting a lot of the identity and access, credentialed access attacks that we're throwing at them. And the people that have these solutions to actually detect these types of attacks are far more secure, without question, in the new cloud paradigm.
Yeah, and being able to rotate keys and things like that inside of a vault is really where it's at. But I feel like, at least from my perspective, like it's a road to get there, right? Like it's not just like a drop of a hat and all of a sudden you're implementing those systems, right? There's a lot of planning and design and coding involved in getting to that point where you can take advantage of a vault, which we all need to be striving to get there.
Yeah, and I think the other challenge here in this space is we're going to have lots of different authentication sources, right? You've got different cloud providers, you got on-prem stuff, right? I did a briefing with Polarize. We covered them a couple weeks ago with their funding round because we were trying to figure out what is it that they do. One of the things that they do is they actually help you understand what the different authorizations are, the entitlements across all these different potential authentication sources, and roll that back. It's getting complex to manage identity across a very hybridized environment. And I think you're going to see more solutions like that. Try to centralize some of that visibility and bring it together, and then they'll add additional capabilities onto it. So there's a lot of innovation, I still think, coming in the identity space.
Well, but there has to be, right? There has to be from the perspective of not necessarily just innovation from the security space, but all of these different technologies are progressing so incredibly quickly that it's not even a matter of innovating. It's just a matter of keeping up at this point. Bo just finished up his cloud pen testing class last week, and he had an authentication attack lab against Microsoft Azure, and he tested it on Friday, and it worked. And then by the time they got to Monday, Azure had changed something behind the scenes, and it completely broke the lab for his students, which is good. I mean, we can play that off and say, hey, this shows that they're improving. But that's just one small example that shows just how quick this entire surface area can change. And the thing that I'm concerned about with a lot of these companies that are developing these solutions for protecting identity and access management and authentication is a lot of these companies aren't lightweight enough to keep up with the changes in these architectures. So they tend to just protect a handful of core protocols, but then there's all these other little ones that are kind of swirling around all over the floor that they might be missing. And that's ultimately my concern. But just trying to keep up right now is an absolute nightmare in this space.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of interesting, John. Based on your point, the cloud providers are implementing a DevOps process to move more quickly, right?
Yep.
The security solutions providers are, and we as customers with our own software are. And how many gaps are going to exist between all three of those, right? I mean, I've seen that in some of my own, web scraping code. It's just like who's winning at any given time, because everyone can change stuff now, regardless of where they are in DevOps. You're moving more quickly than a waterfall model, right? And that means
absolutely.
The page is changing. Now my code has to change. Maybe the cloud provider's code and the API gateway has to change. And how do we all stay in sync? And I think those differences and gaps can lead to security issues.
Well, and I agree with that. I think that there's one silver lining in all of this. Throughout the history of us talking about a lot of cloud security issues on the show, things that we've seen and stories that we've talked about on Security Weekly and on Enterprise Security Weekly, one theme that keeps coming back to me is why the hell hasn't this been hit harder by the attackers? And I think what that shows is a lot of the traditional attack vectors are still very effective for attackers, and they're going to continue to use those attack vectors. Traditional spear phishing, business email compromise, ransomware, they're going to keep rolling with that. And my fear is the attackers haven't quite shifted their focus yet over to cloud and authentication and starting to attack those technologies, because almost all of the vulnerabilities that are identified are security researchers that find those security vulnerabilities. And almost all of the different stories about a breach or a leak of like S3 data or authentication not being implemented, once again, is from security companies and security researchers. It's fairly rare. I mean, it does happen that we see a breach of these technologies and it's directly related to a malicious external attacker launching this attack.
Why change the techniques when they still work, John? Right? That's the point.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, they've already built all the capabilities, so they'll just keep doing it until it eventually gets stopped. Then they'll shift over to this area, and then we'll see what kind of holes we have in our environment.
And I think what this says is, correct me if I'm wrong, we have a little bit of a head start here. And my question is, are we actually using that effectively with a lot of these companies that are implementing these solutions, or are we squandering it? And I can't honestly answer that question. I don't even have an opinion on that, but I think it's a question we have to ask in the industry.
I did want to talk about bot detection before John drops. So Auth0 has launched bot detection. And I guess my first question is this a product or a feature now? Because we see everyone announcing bot detection, right, and trying to bake it into their product suites. But they describe bot detection as monitoring IP addresses for non-suspicious events, and then correlating IP reputation data. If you look at how others are doing it in the market, it's session-based, not IP-based. I feel like there could be a gap in IP-based, right? Because if I can trick your AI into believing my IP is good, my IP address is good, then I'm off to the races. Whereas if Google's looking at it on a session basis, I think that's a much better approach.
I think it's got to be the session basis. I don't understand how you can effectively do this from an IP reputation perspective, and do it effectively. I would say almost anything from a threat intel feed to bot detection, if you're relying strictly based on IP addresses, you're hosed. And one of the reasons why I think you're hosed is if you're dealing with a botnet and it's doing scraping across multiple different computer systems, those IP addresses are going to rotate. They're not all going to be on and scraping all the time.
Yeah, and John, your team, I've actually used some of your software from your team in GitHub for rotating IP addresses.
You're welcome.
Awesome.
But Paul, that also gets into a larger question. If you're going to do reputation, and it looks like Google or a system from Google is scraping your website, or Amazon is scraping your website, what the hell is?
That was my impression of this article too, John. I was like, that's not an approach.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is a feature because what's happening is the analysts are starting to cover bot detection as a separate market. People want to be in that market too. And so here's a feature capability that's been added. But to your point, it's IP based. And even when you look at the volumes, can they really keep up with the Googles of the world that are seeing literally billions of these sessions compared to, 100,000 IP addresses? I mean, the scale between what Google can do with their reCAPTCHA to this is like night and day.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Now, Auth0 did announce $120 million in Series F funding as well. And again, I think we're going to, and I don't want to knock their feature too much, right? But if you can turn this on in Auth0 and it does help prevent some attacks, I think that's a good thing, right? Having a layer there, and if it's something you have and it's a feature in a product you already have, and you're using Auth0 for other things, for securing a remote access, which we talked about as an issue, it's not a bad thing. And they did just secure some funding as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think the power in Auth0 here is their broader story, right? It's really them and ForgeRock playing in this space, and they're trying to become that kind of central authentication component across all these different platforms. Great, fantastic. People see value in that. I mean, they've raised a lot of money, like 330 plus million. It puts them in unicorn status at 1.29 billion, right? We've seen the same thing with ForgeRock and some of the things that they've done. So look, from a broader sense, there's great capabilities here.
Yeah,
I'm just not sure their bot detection announcements, all that in a bag of chips.
No, because I think
Auth0's still doing good stuff.
Yeah, because you want to look at where you're using Auth0, and then look at maybe your enterprise level applications where you've got 1 million users that you have to support. Then you can lean towards Google, right, to do that. You're not going to maybe have one solution for everything, right? And I think Google's solution is great for protecting your user base using your application, whereas you might use Auth0 in different use cases and take advantage of the bot detection.
Yeah, cool. And I think a lot of people are going after...
Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Bye.
And I think a lot of people are running after Okta in this particular case as well, right? And so these guys are alternatives to Okta.
Right.
It's an established public company, and so these are also looking at Okta's. Can we take out somebody like an Okta? I mean, good luck. I mean,
yeah, it's true. Yeah, Okta's a good player in that space, big player. Anchor has unveiled their Enterprise 2.4. They've enhanced some of their security reports, allowing users to compare 2 different container images, enabling developers to more easily spot issues in application versus the operating system, as well as vulnerability detection improved with support for a hint file that can prompt for detection of security issues explicitly declared in libraries. They say it's useful for languages like Go that don't support formal package management. That was a pretty cool announcement from Anchor. I think they're doing pretty well in the space. I liked their product announcement. I think they're addressing issues that I, as a developer and security person, identify with. So, and sometimes we don't always find that in product announcements. Sometimes we're like, huh? But these were very relevant to my interests.
Yeah, I mean, this is the continual evolution of some of the container static analysis capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, a lot of the open source products had some limitations in what it could and couldn't do,
Oh, yeah.
and now you're enhancing these capabilities on enterprise products. So, this makes a lot of sense. There's probably other solutions that do similar things, but they are solving challenges that developers have. You know this more than anybody else with the builds in our system.
Well, I'll tell you what. Being on the latest version of your languages and frameworks and libraries is a huge step in the right direction, right? So I haven't gotten us to Python 3. Now we're automatically, in every build, we're automatically updating all of our libraries. Now, that can be a double-edged sword and work against you because the update is what could have some malicious code in it, right? So you do need an SCA and a vulnerability identification in your software still, but I want to, I guess, like caution enterprises, like move to the point where you can be auto updating in your build process. That's step one. Then think about your requirements, define your requirements, and then implement a solution, right? In so many instances I've seen where the security solution comes in before you've done the project to like fix the fundamental issue, right? The fundamental issue here is let's get your software automatically updating in all your libraries and dependencies. If you're on older frameworks and you haven't updated your code to support them, that's the project you need to be working on. Then develop your requirements and say, okay, how can we make this better? And choose the right solution to say, if I did get a new library, is it being scrutinized in some other SCA type software to make sure it doesn't go into the build?
Yeah, because all you're doing is scanning the old code, finding the same vulnerabilities that haven't been updated.
Yeah.
The recommendation's the same.
Right.
Upgrade.
Well, and I've seen recommendations like, well, you should implement two-factor authentication. It's like, well, how about we consolidate our solutions first and then think about how we might secure them, right? In a lot of cases, we tend to put the cart before the horse, right? The security maturity model in its beginning stages is really about consolidating a lot of that technology and also fixing the fundamental process issues that allow you or preventing you from updating your software, patching your systems, being on the latest frameworks. I mean, you use Equifax and a number of examples of, there was an older framework in there. It didn't matter. You could have all the security solutions in the world, but if you can't fix that one issue, why have all the security solutions, right? Fix the fundamental blocking and tackling first.
Yep.
Couple more funding.
About there's some more funding and acquisition announcements in here. The Proofpoint announcement's interesting. I brought this one in because buyback programs are interesting, right? Proofpoint's a public company. They've issued stock that's available on the open market. Here, they're planning to buy $300 million of that stock back. What's interesting about that is that's usually a very positive sign for the company.
Oh, interesting.
So when a company buys its stock back, you're reducing how much is in the open market for sale, and that's usually a very positive or bullish sign that the company's doing well.
Right.
Right. So that's why I brought this in, because when you see these types of announcements, you're like, Proofpoint must be doing pretty well. They're buying their own stock back.
It's still not my top choice. Nothing against Proofpoint or anything, but when I look at that market, I think there's a lot of innovation in that market that once you have defined your requirements in accordance with a lot of the discussions we've had, in the past year or so, I have other players that I think, certainly a Mimecast or a Great Horn that I would consider. And I'm not saying you choose one over the other, right? But I would consider other
use
solutions.
Cases. Yeah,
and based on your use case, but don't just start renewing with Proofpoint without doing the research first, right? And then Proofpoint could be perfectly fine for your organization, and that's cool, but make sure that you do the due diligence to evaluate your requirements and your solution, especially when it comes to email and email phishing and security.
Yeah, and I think the challenge I have with Proofpoint, outside of this a positive-looking view on buyback, is they've acquired a lot of technologies over the years. They're trying to do a lot of stuff for a lot of people. How well do these solutions work versus a Mimecast or a Great Horn? When it comes to email, maybe there are better solutions out there just because Proofpoint's portfolio has gotten so big over the years.
Yep. Palo Alto has acquired the Crypsys Group for $265 million. Now I got to remember, I read this article the other day.
Yeah, so this is incident response, risk management, and digital forensics consulting firm, which means this is going to be part of what part of the portfolio?
Cortex.
It's not Prisma. Yeah, Cortex.
Yeah, Cortex.
It's probably part of Cortex, right? So now you've got product capabilities in the space. Now what they've done is hired a consulting firm in this space. So again, expanding capabilities. There's a lot of people have been saying, look, they're going after Splunk. They are building not only product capabilities, they're also building service capabilities.
Right. Almost like an MDR. They're poised to be an MDR now, basically.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Yep,
going back to our previous conversation.
Right, exactly right.
There was another one. Firemon has secured $40 million in debt financing. What does that mean, Matt? I always refer to you in these fancy finance terms.
Yeah, so there's different ways to fund and finance a company. You can go raise money from the investors, right? Seed, A, B, different series rounds. Those have a dilutionary effect for the shareholders because you're bringing in new capital. A debt round means you now have the ability to borrow money as a debt instrument that's at a interest rate, but it's non-dilutionary, which means the shareholders aren't getting diluted here, but it gives them the ability to tap into that money to make investments, but it has an interest-bearing component to it. So it's just another instrument to fund a company. Typically what happens, Paul, is you get to a certain level of raises and people are like, yeah, we're diluted enough. We don't want to do another raise.
There's not enough equity to go around anymore, so you got to do a debt round if you want to raise capital.
Do a debt round. Yep. And that's what they did.
Gotcha. And you had InfoSum.
Yeah, this was interesting. InfoSum's a UK-based data platform. It's around privacy. They raised $15 million and brought in a new chairman of the board. It just, we're seeing some very interesting product announcements with privacy starting to take a little more center stage, especially in Europe with GDPR, but you're going to start to see some of those trends in the US with CCPA. So just some new privacy-based companies coming into the mix. So you're going to see some interesting announcements. What I thought was interesting is their funding folks, Akamai's in this, Experian, and AT&T were actually part of this funding round. So just some interesting companies investing in this company.
That concludes the news. Just a couple more quick announcements before we go into our pre-recorded interviews. There's 4 of them coming up, so make sure you stay tuned for that. B-Sides Boston is back in action for their 10-year anniversary. The conference will be held on Saturday, September 26th. Tickets are only $10. You can get yours by visiting bsidesbos.org. Some of the Security Weekly team will be in our own channel on the B-Sides Boston Discord server, answering questions and possibly doing some contests. Also, if you have a specific guest or topic you would like to see on our shows, make sure you go to securityweekly.com/guests. And for anyone else, if you work for a company and you're like, hey, we should really have someone on Security Weekly, send your folks to go fill out that form on securityweekly.com/guests. And we'll work on getting them on the show if it's appropriate. So stay tuned. Pre-recorded interviews coming up next.